Chapter 51 New Zealand. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Prime Minister Evan is worthy of being a senior politician who has ruled the colony of New South Wales for more than 10 years. His perspective on viewing and thinking about issues is much better than that of Henry, who was just an ordinary official in the city government. Similar to Arthur's idea, Australia's current development centre is still local industrialisation and other infrastructure construction. Now incorporating New Guinea into the mainland will only increase the burden on Australia and will not bring many practical benefits. Continuing to retain the colony of New Guinea is a more affordable way for Australia. It can not only continue to oppress New Guinea and use nearly 700,000 indigenous people as its free labour force, but also concentrate on developing the Australian mainland. But Arthur is a monarch after all, and he can't just jump out and discourage his subordinates. Therefore, Arthur's point of view, or a more correct point of view, needs to be expressed by another official, and Arthur only needs to agree. Obviously, Prime Minister Evan still has some experience in this area. At least he knows what the most correct choice for Australia is now, and he also knows what Arthur will most likely choose. After Prime Minister Evan expressed his point of view, Arthur did not arbitrarily support someone's point of view, but smiled and said to everyone, "Since everyone only has these two ideas, let everyone agree on this. Vote for both ideas. We are a democratic government. Since everyone has differences, let's decide in a democratic way." Although this is said, in fact smart people already know which view to support. Most people can see the difference in Arthur's attitude towards these two ideas. Even if it is not obvious, they can still feel which idea they are satisfied with. However, this voting method still makes political novices like Henry's quite satisfied. Everyone feels that their opinions are fully respected. Even if they are not adopted, they are not obviously rejected, right? Soon, the results of the vote came out smoothly, and everyone agreed that New Guinea would continue to be an Australian colony and renamed Australian New Guinea. All New Guinea's institutional policies remain unchanged, except that its allegiance has changed to Australia. As for the candidate for governor of New Guinea, Arthur recommended Aníbal Enrique Hernández, which was agreed and approved by everyone in the cabinet. Aníbal Enrique Hernández is also one of the men left to Arthur by Duke Arthur. He is a relatively versatile talent. Although Aníbal Enrique Hernández does not have outstanding one-way abilities, his overall abilities are basically maintained above the qualifying level, and he is relatively loyal to Arthur and the royal family, making him a good candidate for governor. After all, Arthur didn't think about what New Guinea could do under the rule of Aníbal Enrique Hernández. His biggest task was to maintain the stability of Australian New Guinea and transfer the funds from Australia to New Guinea on time every year. The wealth and resources collected by Australian New Guinea can be transported to Australia. After solving the management problems of the New Guinea colony, Arthur threw the New Zealand problem to the government. New Zealand is different from British New Guinea. New Zealand is one of the self-governing colonies of the United Kingdom and has a population of close to 1 million. Like Australia before it, New Zealand was also seeking political and economic independence, and became an autonomous region of the United Kingdom in 1907. It became completely independent in 1947 and joined the British Commonwealth. Although New Zealand lags behind Australia in terms of land area and population, we have to deny that New Zealand is a country that has begun to seek independence. New Zealand's policies and systems should be treated with caution, otherwise it is likely to lead to New Zealand becoming independent. The dissatisfaction of New Zealanders led to the separation of New Zealand from Australia. Furthermore, Arthur had no sovereignty over New Zealand and merely served as governor of New Zealand for 20 years under the orders of Queen Victoria. Although in the past 20 years, Arthur has gained management rights over New Zealand and has gained advantages in ruling New Zealand. But this does not mean that New Zealand is firmly in Arthur's hands. Because there is no legal basis, Arthur's only high hope is that in the New Zealand referendum 20 years later, the majority of New Zealanders will choose to remain under Arthur's rule and form a joint country with Australia. Such a united country is not without history. One of the major powers now, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is a united country composed of the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. The Austrian Emperor Franz is also the King of Hungary. However, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a serious shortcoming, that is, the two countries were not closely united. Although the Austrian Empire was generally dominated, the Kingdom of Hungary still maintained a high degree of autonomy, and it was more like two countries living side by side. Although relying on Franz's outstanding talents, this patchwork country can operate and maintain its position as a great power, but such a country could not withstand unexpected ravages. After the defeat in World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was split into several small countries, and the prestige of the former great powers also disappeared. New Zealand is far away from Australia, so it is impossible to directly annex it as a new state of Australia. Therefore, a better solution in the future is to form a new country with New Zealand and merge the two countries into one. Everyone, regarding New Zealand, can you tell us what we should do? Our rule over New Zealand is only for 20 years. If we cannot properly solve New Zealand's problems within these 20 years, then 20 years later, we can only sit back and watch New Zealand return to the embrace of the United Kingdom, or let it become a new independent country. Arthur glanced at the crowd and raised the most complicated problem. After taking a look at everyone, he found that no one came out to answer the question directly, so Arthur started to name names directly. Prime Minister Evan, as the former Prime Minister of the colony of New South Wales, you should be able to sympathise with the idea of a colony like New Zealand seeking independence. Tell me, how should we deal with the management issues of New Zealand? Continue. Should we regard New Zealand as a colony or as a new regional management? Faced with the issue of New Zealand's independence, should we sit back and do nothing, or should we allow New Zealand's independent actions? Arthur asked. These questions are not easy to answer. Arthur is currently the governor of New Zealand. If New Zealand is allowed to succeed in direct independence, it will not be of any benefit to Arthur, but if New Zealand's independent actions are suppressed, will New Zealanders still have a good impression of Arthur? If Arthur loses the hearts and minds of New Zealanders, will there be a chance for Australia to merge with New Zealand to form a new country after New Zealand's referendum 20 years later? First update, please support. The second update will be delivered soon, please support me. Chapter 52 Diplomatic Layout. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Your Highness, I don't think New Zealand's problems can be solved in a short time, and the solution depends on your Highness's views on New Zealand. Prime Minister Evan stood up and replied. Prime Minister Evan, please tell me in detail. Arthur said with a smile. The New Zealand problem was also a headache for Arthur, so brainstorming was a good idea. At least the prime ministers of the major colonies were familiar with the situation in New Zealand, and their opinions might be useful to Arthur. Your Highness, regarding New Zealand's policy, it actually depends on your thoughts. Prime Minister Evan saw that Arthur did not refute, but was very interested, so he continued, if you regard New Zealand as a peaceful country, if a colony like New Guinea believes that New Zealand is not within our future core regional influence, then I think we should suppress New Zealand's independent forces. At least during your rule, New Zealand should not become independent. There shouldn't even be any independent action. But if you want to completely integrate New Zealand and merge it with Australia to form a new country, then I think you should fully respect the public opinion of the New Zealand people and even promote New Zealand's reform when the time is right. Independence allows New Zealand to join the Australian family as an independent country. Prime Minister Evan explained, in my opinion, whether it is Australia or New Zealand, its independent public opinion is unstoppable. Even if New Zealand's independence may be suppressed in a short period of time due to the policies and methods of the people in power. But this situation will definitely not last for long. It can be as short as 10 years or as long as decades. New Zealand will definitely explode. There will be much stronger independent actions than now. Therefore, I think that before we establish the management policy for New Zealand, we should clarify New Zealand's status in Australia in the future. If we want to completely take New Zealand into our hands, then at this time, it should be regarded as an independent country, not our colony. After all, New Zealand's status is actually the same as Australia's. Both have begun to seek to transform from a colony to an independent country, even though New Zealand lags far behind Australia in terms of land area and population. Public opinion cannot be ignored. Well, you're right, Prime Minister Evan. Arthur nodded and said to Prime Minister Evan with admiration. New Zealand is the third largest region in Oceania and is also a natural barrier to the east of Australia. I think New Zealand is an integral part of Australia's power in the future, and we should value and respect the interests of New Zealand and New Zealanders. I believe that it is very possible for Australia and New Zealand to form a closely united country, whether it is a federal or confederal country, or a united and unified country. In short, New Zealand is both for us and for Australia. It is very important and an important territory that we cannot lose. During the entire period of managing New Zealand, we should acquiesce and support the independence of New Zealand, as long as New Zealand is willing to unite with Australia and establish a new country, then whether New Zealand is independent or not is not important to Australia. Arthur said with a smile, New Zealand's important geographical location determines that Australia cannot give up on New Zealand. In Arthur's view, as long as New Zealanders are willing to form a new country with Australia, it doesn't matter whether New Zealand is independent or not. Your Highness, do our policies in Australia also need to be implemented in New Zealand? It would be terrible if we build New Zealand but New Zealand turns around and directly declares independence. Treasury Secretary Roger Joseph Ebert asked quickly, although Australia's finances have been depleted, there are still nearly £90 million in funds. But don't forget, even these funds were borrowed from Arthur. Together with the equipment worth £50 million, the Australian government already owes the royal family £150 million. Although the funds are all interest-free loans, the feeling of owing money is definitely unpleasant. This also makes Secretary Roger Joseph Ebert carefully calculate every penny he spends after taking charge of the Ministry of Finance. It is not easy to save money as much as possible while meeting the needs of national development. That's not necessary, Your Highness. If we popularize all Australia's policies to New Zealand now, it may cause the people of New Zealand to be ecstatic in a short time. But what happens after that? What other means do we have to retain these New Zealanders? New Zealanders. Once these people are dissatisfied and want new welfare policies, what will we do? Don't forget, our base is in Australia, and to control New Zealand, we must also control Australia. Prime Minister Evan stood up quickly and reminded, Your Highness, I think what New Zealand needs now is stability, not change. We only need to maintain the policies of New Zealand during the British period and wait until New Zealand becomes independent. When the craze cannot be stopped, our policies are also the conditions for us to win over New Zealanders. Well, what Prime Minister Evan said makes sense. Our base is Australia at all times, and we should also give priority to respecting the opinions of Australians. It is enough for New Zealand to remain stable for the time being, and wait until New Zealand seeks independence. At that time, the various policies we implemented in Australia were also conditions for attracting New Zealanders. As long as they are willing to continue to accept Australian rule, Australia does not mind treating New Zealand as part of itself and will treat New Zealand with all preferential conditions. Sealand will execute it. Arthur nodded, agreeing with Prime Minister Evan's opinion. Roger Joseph Ebert breathed a sigh of relief when Arthur said this. If Australia's various policies are implemented simultaneously in New Zealand, then this will be at least an expenditure of millions or even tens of millions of pounds. For Australia, which is in urgent need of funds for development, this fund can naturally be saved. But at the same time, it is also necessary to properly draw in and get closer to New Zealand. Minister Andrew, these tasks will be left to you. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is responsible for getting closer to New Zealand and trying its best to sign an agreement with New Zealand. The series of treaties have narrowed the distance between Australia and New Zealand in all aspects. In these aspects, we should give New Zealand due respect, and the treaty should provide equality and fairness to both parties and satisfy all New Zealanders. Arthur ordered, on the premise that major policies remain unchanged, a series of trade and other treaties are signed in advance with New Zealand to narrow the distance between Australia and New Zealand, which will also have certain implications for the possible merger of Australia and New Zealand in the future. Benefits. Second update, please support. Today's data is very important, I beg you all for your support. Kneel down and thank you. Chapter 53 Heading to Europe. You are listening at novelfull.audio. On October 30, 1900, after a few days of brief preparations and giving instructions on domestic affairs, Arthur took a series of officials including Foreign Minister Andrew, Industry Minister Pierre, and Defense Minister Kent to a large diplomatic delegation formed and officially embarked on a journey to Europe. This diplomatic visit team has two purposes. One is to follow Arthur to attend the funeral of Queen Victoria, and the other is to seek support and more technology from Britain and Germany. Needless to say, the German side naturally wanted to let Australia harass France's colonies in Asia and Africa during the war, so William II would not be stingy with industrial and technological support at this time. In the UK, although Queen Victoria has passed away, the will made by Queen Victoria will also be held with Queen Victoria's funeral and will be spread to the entire UK and even the entire world. At this relatively special moment, neither Crown Prince Edward nor British officials would violate Queen Victoria's will at the risk of offending the British people. Therefore, it is still easy for Australia to obtain greater support from the United Kingdom and Germany, and it is reasonable to sign some immigration and trade treaties at this time. The 31st, which is immediately adjacent to the 30th, is a famous holiday in the West. Halloween, however, there were no children on Arthur's warship. Therefore, on Halloween, which was supposed to be spent happily, Arthur temporarily ordered officials to work overtime and held corresponding meetings. This diplomatic visit team was extremely formal. Not only 3 cabinet ministers were dispatched, but officials from basically every department joined in order to seek support from Britain and Germany in all aspects. The reason why it caused such a stir among various cabinet departments is that thanks to the dual efforts of Queen Victoria and Arthur, the British Empire and the German Empire's support for Australia was basically free and selfless. Of course, the biggest contributor to this was Queen Victoria. At present, the world's largest naval power and largest army power provides support to Australia, so how can Australia grow? On November 27, after nearly a month, the Australian fleet finally docked in the port of London, England. Said to be a fleet, it was actually a few warships put together by the navies of several colonies. Because the size of the navy directly under each colony is not large, Australia's navy is not large either. There are only a few light cruisers and frigates, and some coastal defense gunboats. Only these light cruisers and frigates can be on the table. This is also the largest fleet dispatched by the Australian visiting mission. After docking at the port, Princess Beatrice greeted them at the port on behalf of the royal family. During this period of time, countless warships from major European countries and even major countries around the world have gone to Britain to pay their condolences and attend the funeral of Queen Victoria. Because he was a member of the British royal family, Arthur was arranged in the original room in Buckingham Palace. Royal members and senior officials of other countries basically do not have this treatment. Except for royal members of some powerful countries, others can only live in major hotels in London or some small manors. Arthur's original room is located in a corner of Buckingham Palace, next to Duke Arthur's original room. This huge corner lot and various nearby buildings were owned by the Arthur family, but unfortunately it has long since changed. Returning to the familiar room, the furnishings and decorations remained unchanged. Although no one had lived in it for more than half a year, it could be seen that the room was cleaned every day and it was still spotless and very clean and tidy. This room was the place Arthur was most familiar with in the UK. He travelled to the UK for 3 full months, and because he was not familiar with it, he spent most of his time in this room reading books. After staying in his room quietly for a few minutes, a guard soon came to deliver a message that Prince Edward wanted to have dinner with him. Arthur did not hesitate and followed the guard to the banquet hall. Although he came to England, Arthur was not worried about his personal safety. As Queen Victoria's last will and testament spread throughout Britain and the world, and even in the last moments of Queen Victoria's life, Arthur held Queen Victoria's hand. Currently, Arthur already has a preliminary favourable impression in the hearts of all British people. Many British people who originally respected Queen Victoria began to pay attention to Arthur after Queen Victoria's death. If something happens to Arthur in the UK, the British government and royal family may suffer the greatest anger from the British people before Queen Victoria's funeral. No British person would allow Arthur, whom Queen Victoria cared about and loved even before her death, to have any accident happen during her visit to England to attend Queen Victoria's funeral. It can be said that as long as Arthur does not take the initiative to go against the British and does not say anything to hurt the British, then all the actions of Queen Victoria during her lifetime were Arthur's last protective umbrella. As long as Queen Victoria's prestige in the hearts of the British was not completely eliminated, Arthur would gain the favour and care of all British people. Arriving at the banquet hall of Buckingham Palace, Arthur felt sad again. This was once the place where Queen Victoria entertained foreign guests. Unexpectedly, Prince Edward now uses it to entertain himself. The meaning is self-evident. Crown Prince Edward wants to use this to remind himself that he is now the definite master of Britain, and Arthur, even if he receives sympathy from the British, he is only a guest of Crown Prince Edward in Britain. Shaking his head and smiling, Arthur sat quietly in his seat, waiting for the arrival of Crown Prince Edward. After a while, Prince Edward greeted him with a smile. Arthur stood up, smiled and said to Prince Edward, "Uncle Edward." "Well, long time no see, Arthur. It's been a month since we last saw each other on the Isle of Wight. I haven't been to the UK for a long time. How does it feel to be back?" Crown Prince Edward was polite at first, and then slightly he asked with a meaningful smile. "It's okay, Uncle. Although the UK is indeed much more prosperous than Australia, after getting used to it in Australia, I feel that the UK is no longer used to it." Arthur replied, "This is actually true. Arthur prefers the unfettered life in Australia to living under someone else's roof in the UK. Ha ha ha, you are not adapting because you lost your grandmother, Arthur. It doesn't matter, you still have me in the UK, Arthur. If you have anything to say to me during this time, I can take care of you. Solve it." Crown Prince Edward got the reply he wanted and said with a smile immediately, "First update, please support." Chapter 54 Urban Planning. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Have your officials settled down? There are many guests coming to the UK during this period. Arthur must forgive me for not being able to greet you in person. Crown Prince Edward smiled and said. After receiving a satisfactory answer from Arthur, Crown Prince Edward's smile became even warmer. Even the officials brought over by Arthur, Crown Prince Edward did not forget to show concern. "Everything has been settled with the help of Aunt Beatrice. My uncle is busy with his grandmother's funeral and British government affairs, so it is normal for him to have no time." Arthur replied, "Although it is inevitable to obtain support from the United Kingdom, how much support can be obtained depends on the attitude of Crown Prince Edward. As long as he doesn't break his skin, Arthur still doesn't mind building a good relationship with Crown Prince Edward. After all, Australia's interests do not conflict with the British Empire in a short period of time. At least until Britain does not sink, Australia is not qualified to fight against Britain." Ha ha ha, Arthur doesn't mind. Come on, try it. These are the foods you love to eat in England. I specially asked the chef to make them for you. I've been in Australia for a long time, so I think you miss it too. Are they there? Even if you have a few chefs given to you by your grandmother, it is not easy to make authentic British tastes in Australia. Crown Prince Edward smiled and began to invite Arthur to taste the food that had been prepared. Under the tacit greetings between Prince Edward and Arthur, a very warm uncle-nephew dinner was experienced in the banquet hall. During this period, Crown Prince Edward and Arthur were like ordinary uncles and nephews, talking about interesting things between them for a long time. It wasn't until the night got darker that the two of them ended the dinner as if they suddenly realized something. Reminded by the guards next to them. Although most of the exchanges during the dinner were nonsense, Arthur also learned some important news. The first is the arrangements for Queen Victoria's funeral. After discussions between the British Cabinet Government and Crown Prince Edward, it was decided that Queen Victoria's official funeral was scheduled for November 29. 2 days later, the second event was the official coronation ceremony of Prince Edward. Although in theory, after the death of Queen Victoria, Crown Prince Edward automatically obtained the title of King of England, but Prince Edward will not officially become the King of the United Kingdom until his coronation ceremony. The coronation ceremony of Prince Edward was scheduled for the 7th day after Queen Victoria's funeral, that is, December 6, 1900. As for the discussion of supporting Australia, it will have to wait until Edward actually succeeds as king and a meeting will be held. The decision will be made by the meeting at that time. Overall, it was acceptable to Arthur. After all, Arthur still has a lot of favour and popularity among British people. If the matter of British support for Australia is left to the British Cabinet Government to decide, then the government composed of political parties will also have to consider the ideas of the British people. From this perspective, it is undoubtedly more beneficial for Aspen and Australia. Back in the room, Arthur was also tired. He simply made the bed, then lay on the bed and fell asleep. During the 2 days when Queen Victoria's funeral was not held, Arthur and the Australian diplomatic team were relatively relaxed. Since there was nothing to do, Arthur took the diplomatic delegation to visit London these 2 days, admiring the beautiful scenery of the British capital while conducting research on various advanced things and discussing the possibility of their implementation in Sydney. Sydney is a good capital for New South Wales, but for Australia, it can only be regarded as a qualified capital. Because the city of Sydney was only a colony at the time, it was not well planned. Although the population is not very large now, the problems in various aspects are not very prominent, but as Australia introduces more and more immigrants, Sydney's population will gradually grow, and will even reach a city with a population of 500,000 or even 1 million in the future. Under such circumstances, Sydney's urban planning seems to be somewhat backward, and many problems will become serious. Over time, now taking the diplomatic corps to visit London is to seek opportunities for solutions. London, as the capital and one of the most developed cities in the United Kingdom, has a population of more than 2 million. In terms of its level of development, London is definitely one of the brightest pearls in the world. Its urban construction may have some inhumane aspects, but overall, it is still worthy of reference, as long as serious problems like industrial emissions are avoided. London's urban construction will still be relatively good. Most of the representatives of the mission have experienced the world, so in addition to admiring the beautiful scenery of London, they also began to discuss whether London's various construction plans can be implemented in Sydney. In other words, referring to London's urban construction, Sydney, what improvements can be made. Different from the original history, the current capital of Australia is Sydney, not Melbourne. In history, Melbourne is currently Australia's largest city, followed by Sydney in second place. The second largest city, Sydney, was chosen as the capital because Sydney is the capital of New South Wales and Melbourne is the capital of Victoria. In terms of size and influence, the influence of New South Wales is greater than that of Victoria, which is why Arthur made Sydney his capital. However, both Sydney and Melbourne have more or less shortcomings. Neither of them considered the possibility of becoming a huge city in their design. Judging from the current urban design of Sydney, it can accommodate a maximum population of more than 1 million. Any more will cause considerable problems to the urban design and cause chaos. Although 1 million people may seem like a lot, cities with 1 million people are now common among major powers and developed countries. If Australia wants to become a powerful country, the upper limit of the capital must not be just 1 million, but it must be at least millions or even millions. This also means that the government is bound to improve the construction of major cities in Australia, especially the construction of the capital Sydney. Otherwise, there may be no impact in the short term, but when a large wave of immigrants arrives, Australia and Sydney will suffer from insufficient urban planning, and chaos will breed. In addition to visiting the sights of London, the 3 ministers were also given a task by Arthur, which was to inquire about the various officials of the British cabinet government and try their best to establish a good relationship with 1 or 2 of them to prepare for the next aid meeting. After all, Britain's aid to Australia is decided by a cabinet meeting, so establishing a good relationship with these British cabinet officials in advance will also help Australia obtain greater assistance in the future. Judging from the relationship between Australia and the United Kingdom, as well as Arthur's reputation and the prestige of the late Queen Victoria, it should not be very difficult for the 3 ministers to establish a good relationship with the British cabinet officials. Second update, please support. I'm not feeling well, I don't have any ideas, and I don't have any young symptoms yet, so don't worry. Chapter 55. The funeral begins. You are listening at novelfull.audio. On November 29, 1900, Queen Victoria's funeral, which had been prepared for a long time, finally began with great ceremony. As a highly prestigious former British monarch, Queen Victoria had extremely detailed arrangements for her funeral, and Edward allowed all of these arrangements. One of the more personal features is that Queen Victoria specifically requested that all people attending the funeral must have white elements, and even the horses at the funeral must be covered with white cloth. This of course also includes the protagonist of this funeral, Queen Victoria. The Queen wore a pure white wedding dress with a white veil covering her head, symbolizing the Queen's fidelity to love and marriage. In order to comply with Queen Victoria's will, William II, Edward, Arthur, Princess Beatrice and the Queen's confidant James Reed, as well as 3 loyal servants, were placed at the Queen's head and sides of the body. Carry it gently and put it into the coffin. This is not an easy job, because Queen Victoria has passed away for a month. Even if the body is well protected, Arthur and others must be extremely careful when carrying it to avoid unnecessary damage to the Queen's body. Destroy. The floor of Queen Victoria's oversized sarcophagus was covered with thick charcoal and then covered with Prince Albert's nightgown. Even though Prince Albert has passed away for more than 40 years, Queen Victoria still keeps her husband's nightgown, which shows how deep the love between the prince and the Queen is. Queen Victoria also had special instructions for placing the funerary objects next to it. Unlike other monarchs who like to put a lot of jewelry and gold coins, Queen Victoria was buried with only his favorite shawl and handkerchief, rings, books and small things such as photos, jewelry boxes, and bracelets. After enjoying a luxurious life for most of her life, what Queen Victoria wanted after her death was not extreme luxury, but as much warmth and memories as possible. Although the value of each burial object may not be too high, it has special meaning to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria experienced the tragic loss of her father in childhood, her husband in middle age, and her son in old age. Combined with the British hegemony in the Victorian era, various deeds pushed this great queen to legendary status. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Queen Victoria's funeral officially began in London. Long before the state funeral of Queen Victoria began, royal families and high-level officials from European and international countries had arrived at Westminster Abbey, also known as Westminster Abbey. Before the funeral, Westminster Abbey rang the bell 81 times to commemorate Queen Victoria's 81-year-old legendary life. Due to Queen Victoria's request for a military funeral, the Queen's coffin was carried on a gun carriage before the funeral began, and hundreds of Royal Navy soldiers pulled the gun carriage. Originally, according to Queen Victoria's will, the artillery carriage should be pulled by 8 White Army horses, but at Arthur's suggestion, hundreds of Royal Navy soldiers were used to pull the gun carriages. The reason why Edward VII and British officials agreed was that doing so would enhance the ritual feel of the entire funeral. At least the grandeur and human touch would be stronger than that of a carriage. Initiated by Queen Victoria, the funeral method of placing the coffin on a cannon cart and being pulled by soldiers has since become a high-level royal tradition. In the original history, another Queen Elizabeth, who reigned longer, also copied the burial method of Queen Victoria. As the gun carriage containing the coffin was slowly escorted by naval soldiers to Westminster Abbey, countless British people along the way sent their high respect and infinite blessings to the great Queen. Although the entire funeral route was only a few kilometers long, the artillery car traveled for more than 2 hours in order to allow Queen Victoria to be watched by more people. Senior royal members such as Edward VII and Arthur walked behind Queen Victoria's coffin and followed the cannon parade, also sending Queen Victoria off on her last journey. At this time, both Edward VII and Arthur were dressed in military uniforms, and their bodies were covered with medals and honors from their countries, but Arthur was in a very heavy mood at this time. After losing Queen Victoria, perhaps the only person Arthur could rely on was himself. Although Princess Louise and her 2 sisters also cared about Arthur very much, they could only give Arthur spiritual comfort at best, but in fact they could not help Arthur at all. At 11 o'clock at noon, Queen Victoria's coffin officially arrived at Westminster Abbey, and the state funeral ceremony officially began. Nearly 1,000 guests attended the ceremony, including senior leaders from various countries and royal families. First, the Archbishop of Canterbury praised the Queen's achievements, praising her for following the example of Christ and spending her life serving the country and the people. Because Queen Victoria's achievements are indeed impressive, there are indeed many words to praise Queen Victoria, including the rise of the British Empire to be the most powerful in the world, the spread of British territory around the world, the establishment of the Indian Empire, and other honors. British Prime Minister Robert also read a passage from the Gospel of John in the Bible at the funeral. Afterwards, the audience observed a 3-minute silence for Queen Victoria, which was also observed across the British Empire. This moment has long been determined. Starting from 11:55 noon on November 29, the silence will last until 58:00, and any colony or region will observe it at the same time. At the end of the ceremony, the British national anthem God Save the Queen was played in the church, and the state funeral ceremony was concluded. After this, Queen Victoria's coffin will be moved to Wellington Arch in the southeast corner of Hyde Park, London, and from there to Windsor Castle for burial. Queen Victoria's coffin procession was quite large, with more than 2,000 soldiers and hundreds of people from civil society groups, because Queen Victoria's prestige in Britain is indeed not low. Soldiers and police were on both sides of the line to maintain order. Big Ben chimes every minute, and in the slow tolling of the bells, Queen Victoria's coffin slowly accompanies the procession through the streets of the capital, passing through groups of rows of mourners, stretching for more than 1 mile, heading towards Windsor Castle. After arriving at Wellington Arch, Queen Victoria's coffin was transferred to the new state hearse and then directly to Windsor Castle. At this time, the largest number of British people came to see him off. Because after the coffin arrives at Windsor Castle, ordinary people are not eligible to enter. Therefore, the stretch between Wellington Arch and Windsor Castle is also the last time that all British people can see the remains of Queen Victoria. As the hearse passed through the street, frantic and mourning crowds threw flowers and applauded the carriage. People couldn't bear to leave the Queen, but they had to accept the Queen's departure. Therefore, people can only express their high respect to Queen Victoria crazily. The bunches of flowers thrown to the hearse also represent Queen Victoria's status in the hearts of the British people. Because Queen Victoria's funeral is approaching, the price of flowers across London has increased. Under such circumstances, people bought bunches of flowers just to throw them at the procession when the Queen's coffin passed by, which is enough to show Queen Victoria's status and popular support in the UK. Let's just say a few words. It's really hard to find out the details of the funeral, because it's so old and many of them are no longer available. Therefore, some of the information in this chapter refers to the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. In addition, I saw some book friends talking about the name of Windsor Castle before. In fact, the British royal family is now named after Windsor Castle. In other words, there was Windsor Castle first and then the Windsor family. Finally, I beg for support. Chapter 56 Conversation after the funeral. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hearse officially arrived outside Windsor Castle and continued along the long walk of Windsor Castle. This is the last section of the road to enter Windsor Castle. Thousands of British people gathered on both sides of the long road to wait. In the reluctant eyes of the British people, Queen Victoria's hearse entered the fence of Windsor Castle and disappeared from the eyes of all British people. The last place where the funeral was held was St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, which is a church often used by members of the royal family for weddings, baptisms and funerals. The burial ceremony was officiated by Bishop David Connaught of St. George's Church. As the burial ceremony was by invitation only nearly 400 guests attended the burial ceremony. The main participants in the ceremony are current and former staff of the royal family and private estates, which actually symbolizes the end of the Queen's reign. The royal crown, the orb and the scepter, symbols of royal power, were removed from the top of the coffin by the crown jeweler, and Queen Victoria was separated from her crown for the last time. Subsequently, under the leadership of Edward VII, all members of the British royal family sang hymns at St. George's Church. Arthur is naturally among them. After the last hymn, the Honour Guard Battalion of the Guards Corps placed the camp flag on the coffin. They are also the highest-level honor guard dedicated to the ceremonial duties of the monarch during his travels. Finally, the church rang out the songs of blessing and God bless our King, and Queen Victoria was sent off to the Royal Mausoleum, where she was buried next to Prince Albert. At this point, Queen Victoria's funeral was officially over. At the same time, it also announced the end of Queen Victoria's reign, and Britain was about to usher in a new era, the reign of Edward VII. Because it was determined that he would rule Britain under the title of Edward VII, Edward's official title at this time should be Edward VII, King of England and Emperor of India. As Queen Victoria's coffin entered the mausoleum, the focus of the audience slowly shifted to Edward VII, as the current King of the United Kingdom and the helm of the British Empire. Edward was able to control a considerable part of the voice and power in the United Kingdom by relying on the remaining prestige of Queen Victoria. Edward's attitude, words and deeds will also determine the subsequent policies and actions of the British government. As the world's largest British Empire, all countries are waiting for Britain to take a stand regarding the current situation in Europe. however, Edward VII behaved extremely low-key at the funeral. Regardless of anyone's conversation or contact, Edward VII maintained a serious attitude and refused everyone's closeness. Everyone had no choice but to disperse, but they did not leave England, because 7 days later, there is still a grander ceremony waiting for everyone to attend, that is the coronation ceremony of Edward VII, today and 7 days later. These people will witness the change of British power and the rotation of the old and the new. Arthur was mixed in among them, and just as he was about to leave quietly, he was stopped by a familiar voice behind him. "Arthur, long time no see," but when he turned around, he saw that it was William II whom he had not seen for a month since leaving the Isle of Wight. William II is equally low-key today. Firstly, the protagonists today can only be Queen Victoria and the British royal family. Secondly, because he is in the UK, he does not receive as much attention as Edward VII. However, William II didn't care about this. On the contrary, the less people paying attention to William II at the scene, the more relaxed William II was. "Cousin William, it's been a long time indeed." Arthur responded with a smile and a salute. Previously, the farewell team could only consist of members of the British royal family, so even if William II was the emperor, he could only wait at Windsor Castle. "Arthur, how about we have a meal together later?" There were too many foreign officials and royal families around, and William II had no intention of discussing matters with Arthur now. "Of course." Arthur nodded and followed William II out of Windsor Palace. One was the Emperor of the German Empire, and the other was the distinguished Duke whom Queen Victoria specifically protected in her will. The departure of William II and Arthur attracted the attention of many people, including Edward VII. King Edward VII watched the two people leave like good friends. A deep light flashed in his eyes, and then he talked to the surrounding guests as if nothing happened. "The restaurant ordered by William II is located in a private manor outside London and is not open to the public. This is a restaurant that only belongs to princes and nobles. Obviously, its owner is William II. It has to be said that the luxury of Western monarchs and nobles, in later generations, the top restaurants with 3-star tiers are only one of many private restaurants, and they cannot even come a few times a year." After asking about Arthur's tastes and preferences, the restaurant's chef got busy preparing lunch for William II and Arthur. As for ordering food, it doesn't exist at all in a restaurant like this. After letting the guards leave, William II looked at Arthur with a smile and said, "Arthur, I didn't expect that Grandma would care about you so much." At the last moment of her life, the first thing she mentioned was actually I give you British New Guinea and New Zealand. Arthur smiled and shook his head and said, "Compared with these two territories, I hope my grandmother will not leave." "Okay, let's not talk about such a heavy topic, Arthur. Grandma has left, but life has to go on, right? After Australia owns British New Guinea and New Zealand, it can already claim to be the overlord of the South Pacific and establish region's sexual hegemony." William II smiled and changed the subject. "I've said it, Cousin William. Where is the regional hegemony? At most, Australia has some say in places like Oceania. There are small colonies of great powers around it, and to the north is the Dutch East Indies, which is protected by various countries. I can only feel at ease. Staying and developing in Oceania has nothing to do with the word hegemony." Arthur shook his head and denied it. If Australia is given another decade or more to develop, there may be hope for establishing regional hegemony in Oceania and Southeast Asia, but if it were only now, Australia would be just a weak regime with colonies that had just become an independent country. What it could barely guarantee was its own independence. "Arthur, how was the discussion with Uncle Edward? Has Britain agreed to provide a large amount of aid to Australia?" William II got to the point and asked curiously, "In terms of bloodline, Australia is undoubtedly closer to Britain. Most Australians are British immigrants and exiled criminals, as well as local Aboriginal people in Australia. After decades or even hundreds of years of combination and evolution, a new nation was finally formed. After Arthur integrated the 6 Australian colonies, the concept of Australians has become very vague, and it can also refer to all citizens of Australia. If we look at it this way, more than half of Australians are of British descent, and the vast majority of Australians have British ancestry." Second update, please support. Recently, the number of words in each chapter has been increased, and I strive to reach 5,000 words in 2 chapters by then. Please support me. Your support is the biggest motivation for the author to code. In addition, thank you all for your monthly votes and recommendation votes, thank you. Chapter 57 William II's Conditions. You are listening at novelfull.audio. For William II, he wanted to see Australia tilt towards Germany. Even if it could not directly participate in future wars, it would at least pose a considerable threat to France's colonies in Eastern Africa and Asia. But if Australia forms a close cooperation with the closer Britain, relying on Britain's strong strength and closer blood relationship, it will be easier to win over Australia. By then, I am afraid that Australia will not only not become a surprise soldier in the war, but will also become a logistics supply station for Britain and France, and may even threaten Germany's overseas colonies. This is something William II does not want to see. The extent of Britain's assistance to Australia is also likely to change Australia's stance on future wars. If it were a frontal war, William II was confident that the German army was not weaker than anyone else, and could even have a huge advantage against any army, but this does not mean that William II has lost all his sanity. If Germany is blocked and all sea transportation lines are blocked, and France and Russia have huge territories and colonies to support them, then no matter how brave the German army is, they will not be able to withstand the enemy. Endless logistical supplies, win over Australia and allow Australia to cause certain damage to France's colonies and maritime transportation lines during the war. It does not require complete destruction, but as long as it can cause partial damage, William II will be confident that he will completely defeat France in the war, or even directly solve the problem. This is why William II was so concerned about British aid to Australia. Compared with Germany, which is far away and has no relationship, Britain has a significantly more important position in the hearts of Australians. The real negotiations have not started, but it is estimated that the annual aid will not be too much. It should be around the £5 million stipulated by Grandma. Arthur pretended to sigh, shook his head and said helplessly. Arthur also knew what William II wanted to know, so he didn't mind making William II happy. In any case, William II would definitely be happy to see Britain reduce support to Australia. Keeping it at £5 million is the best answer. Is £5 million too much? If you look at this figure alone, it is actually quite a lot. It is the total annual income of more than 10,000 outstanding workers. However, this number seems a bit small and weak when placed in the context of the country's industrial development. Under the premise of being supported by huge industrial equipment, Australia's annual industrial development investment is as high as £4 million per year, and it is only a small-scale development plan. For countries with strong industries like Britain and Germany, £5 million is only the cost of 2 main battleships. I thought how much, Arthur? It's true that Uncle Edward, Australia's development is so poor, he is not willing to spend more money to help Australia develop. Grandma specially asked to take care of you, Arthur, before she left. I didn't expect that I would only get £5 million in exchange for it in the end. Sure enough, William II laughed when he heard the £5 million, and his words were full of disparagement of Edward. It's okay. After all, Uncle Edward doesn't have the final say in England alone. £5 million is enough for Australia. At least it can make Australia's industry take off. Arthur continued to pretend to be miserable. Also, by the way, I am waiting for the next words from William II. Okay, Arthur. As your cousin, I feel it is necessary for me to help you in Australia at such a difficult time. Although the German Empire is not as rich as the British Empire, it can afford the assistance. You can still get it. William II patted Arthur's shoulder with his right hand, stood up and said righteously. The low-interest loan of 500 million marks we agreed on before is invalid. I have made the decision and will give the 500 million marks directly to you as a startup capital for your industrial development. At the same time, I will mobilize the major German banks to jointly contribute funds. Provide you with a low-interest loan of at least 1 billion marks. You can use this mark to purchase the industrial equipment and resources you want in any region of Germany. I think, both from the perspective of interests and from the blood relationship between us, judging from the relationship, Germany and Australia are both friends, right? William II waved his hand and directly gave Arthur the 500 million marks he had promised. Judging from the exchange rate between the mark and the pound, the funds provided by William II are approximately £25 million in sponsorship and £50 million in low-interest loans. No matter which country it is considered a large sum of money. Really? Cousin William, thank you so much. On behalf of Australia and all Australians, I would like to thank His Majesty and all Germans for their assistance to Australia. May the friendship between Australia and Germany last forever. Arthur was stunned. For a moment, I didn't expect William II to be so generous. Fortunately, he responded quickly and immediately started complimenting William II. Arthur wouldn't suffer even if he complimented others a few times, let alone under the premise that William II spent a lot of money. Even the aid and loan funds include £75 million, which is absolutely a huge amount of money for Australia's development. This is not over yet, Arthur. As the saying goes, it is better to teach a man to fish than to teach him to fish. Germany will send a team of industrial experts to actually contribute to Australia's industrial development. As long as it does not involve particularly important strategic technologies, Germany can be sold to Australia at market price. We hope that Australia can develop and become the overlord of the South Pacific and provide important help to Germany in the future. We will not regard Australia as our subordinate or weak, but as an extremely important ally, Arthur. After William II said all the conditions, he looked at Arthur and asked with a smile, "How about it, Arthur, are you willing to lead Australia and become an important right-hand man of Germany? If Australia can develop smoothly, then we will help Germany in future wars. If the maritime transportation lines are not cut off, Australia can also export various mineral resources and other materials to Germany to help Germany defeat this war." War. Arthur did not answer directly and affirmatively, but used a more tactful approach, but in William II's view, Arthur actually agreed. After all, not every lord of Arthur's age can withstand such temptation. In William II's view, even though Arthur has great ideas, his heart is actually no different from other people of this age group. They are all more impulsive and idealistic. I believe that once Germany offers such conditions, even if Arthur is not immediately tempted, he will change his position to Germany's side after William II fulfills the conditions promised one by one. It's just that William II didn't expect that Arthur was not a person who would be affected by external factors. What's more, Arthur is a time traveler. With his advanced ideas and experiences in his mind, Arthur will only choose the one that is most beneficial to himself and Australia based on various conditions. First update, please support. My family is pregnant, I am pregnant, and my throat is not feeling well today. If I really get tricked, I will try my best to keep it updated and beg for support. In addition, it is on the new book list. Everyone, please work hard to see if you can push forward. If it is not serious, I will try my best to save the manuscript in the past 2 days, at least to keep updating it every day. Begging for support. Chapter 58 Edward's Coronation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The conversation with William II went very smoothly, not only finalizing Germany's financial assistance to Australia, but also roughly agreeing on a series of plans for industrial assistance and future war assistance. At least in William II's view, he has initially and successfully tied Australia to Germany's chariot, and Germany will also have one more ally in future wars. Arthur and William II agreed on a time to go to Germany, around mid-December. If the negotiations go smoothly, we can spend a good Christmas in Germany and then return to Australia. However, before heading to Germany, there is one slightly more important thing that needs to be negotiated, and that is the aid treaty with the United Kingdom. Although Britain will definitely not be as generous as Germany, for Arthur, anyone who doesn't want this kind of free assistance is a fool. Of course, it is best to get as much as there is. Moreover, there is no conflict between the aid from Germany and the United Kingdom. Both countries are very strong in industry, and one prefers army equipment and the other prefers naval warships. They both have their own technology that is leading the world, which Australia can study and receive. After leaving William II, Arthur returned to Buckingham Palace and convened a meeting of the key members of the diplomatic mission in his office. Fortunately, Buckingham Palace is huge, and so are the rooms allocated to each member of the royal family. XIN not only has its own exclusive reception room and conference room, but it is also relatively large in size. There is no problem in accommodating more than a dozen people for meetings. In fact, the focus of this meeting is to determine the direction in which British support is needed. After all, with Germany's support, many industries and technologies no longer need British support. It's not that Germany's technology is more advanced than Britain's in some aspects, but it's a bit wasteful and extravagant to use limited support in the same direction. Australia is currently in a golden stage of development, and Arthur will naturally not tolerate these precious resources and development opportunities being missed or wasted due to such negligence. The meeting lasted for several hours, and finally the technologies that needed British support were determined, mostly focusing on the shipbuilding industry. This is also an inevitable result. Compared with German industry, Britain has a clear advantage in its achievements in the shipbuilding industry and the warship industry. In terms of warship manufacturing, Britain is still number one in the world and will not be surpassed by other countries in the short term. Members of the diplomatic corps unanimously believe that it is most reasonable and effective to focus Britain's limited resources on the shipbuilding industry, especially warships, although Australia occupies the entire Australian continent. It is actually a huge island country with a large number of overseas territories and territories. This also means that Australia must have a powerful fleet to protect its overseas territories and spheres of influence. After all, for a non-continental country like Australia, the Navy is more important than the Army in many aspects, and the security of the coastline is the first line of defense for the country's territorial security. The shipyard that Arthur originally owned was a shipyard with advanced British shipbuilding technology, although it is only a small shipyard and can only build small-scale warships. All the technologies used are relatively advanced shipbuilding technologies from the UK. If we can build on this and introduce and absorb some more advanced technologies, as well as technology for building medium-sized or even large warships, then Australia's Navy will have hope of rising. As for purchasing warships from major European powers, the warships ordered are generally expensive, generally about twice the cost. Secondly, Arthur was not unaware of the events in Turkey. Under the premise of the increasingly intense naval arms race among European countries, ordering warships now will inevitably lead to this risk. Mastering the means of building warships yourself is the best way. Even if you pay some price for it, it is worth it in the eyes of Arthur and everyone in the diplomatic community. After determining the direction in which they want to seek support, the next task of the diplomatic mission is relatively easy, which is to establish good relations with people in the British political arena, buy a few small newspapers, rush to print newspapers, and improve Arthur and the Australian people. Favorability among British people. Although this task seems urgent, it is actually the easiest to complete. With a background from the British royal family, coupled with a slightly tragic situation in Queen Victoria's will, coupled with the fact that the heat of Queen Victoria's funeral has not dissipated, Arthur was not low profile in the UK at this time, and was even quite loved. As Arthur and the diplomatic corps were busy, the coronation ceremony of Edward VII came soon. The coronation ceremony of King Edward VII of England officially begins, different from the sad atmosphere at Queen Victoria's funeral a week ago. After a week of transition, the streets of London have become joyful, and the whiteness of London has disappeared, as if what happened in the past never happened. In order to show respect for the late Queen, Edward VII's coronation ceremony was streamlined, lasting only about 2 hours. This is much simpler than Queen Victoria's coronation ceremony. Not to mention that Britain is now the well-deserved world's most powerful country. However, this move of Edward VII won the favor of many British people. After all, the British still have Queen Victoria in their hearts. It is not a good thing for most of them to organize a coronation ceremony at this time. The person responsible for presiding over the coronation ceremony was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most senior bishop in the Church of England. In fact, the more formal weddings, baptisms and funerals of royal members are basically presided over by the Archbishop of Canterbury. In the absence of the bishop, another bishop designated by the monarch will preside. But this situation is relatively rare. all procedures for the coronation ceremony were carried out in accordance with the Red Manual of Westminster Abbey, which has never been published publicly for nearly 1,000 years. After completing the grand ceremony, the royal musicians played celebratory music, and then Edward VII rode in a gilded carriage via Buckingham Palace amid the cheers of most British people. Although there were far fewer British people on both sides of the road than at the last funeral, overall it was still bustling. Edward VII waved to the crowd with great satisfaction and walked towards Buckingham Palace amid cheers. As the most powerful country in the world today, the coronation ceremony of the British King still attracted many British people to come and watch. If it hadn't been affected by the Queen's funeral not long ago, I'm afraid the crowd of onlookers would have increased. Second update, please support. In addition, let me talk about an issue that many book friends are struggling with, immigration. Whether it is in terms of their skin color or novel policies, white immigrants are the most preferred. Other immigrants can only say that they are not rejecting them, but they have to be tested before they accept them. There will be no two-way situation, and only immigrants from Europe, especially the United Kingdom, will be truly accepted. In addition, Australia is not black. Chapter 59 Treaty of the Isle of Wight. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Outside the church, tens of thousands of people braved the cold and damp weather to wait, in order not to miss the coronation ceremony of King Edward VII. At least hundreds of people set up tents on the boulevard in front of Buckingham Palace to spend the night before. The price of a seat in a simply built viewing platform has also been raised to more than £10. At the best location overlooking the road, the price of a seat can even reach hundreds of pounds. After Edward VII delivered his coronation speech, the Archbishop of Canterbury raised St. Edward's crown aloft and then lowered it onto the head of his undisputed king. St. Edward's crown is made of gold as the main body and is surrounded by many diamonds as embellishments. It is the oldest and most valuable crown of the British royal family, and it is also the special crown used by monarchs of all ages to ascend the throne and be crowned. There is also a crown that is similar to St. Edward's crown. It is the crown of the British Empire and is only used for daily wear and ceremonial purposes. Long live His Majesty the King. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Robert, the British people present began to cheer and shout for the new British monarch. After the rather grand coronation ceremony, there was the first banquet held by Edward VII as king. The scale of this banquet was relatively large. Not only the senior royals from various countries who had attended the funeral and coronation ceremony were present, but also the British nobles and senior officials were present one by one to offer blessings and celebrations to Edward VII. The only protagonist of this banquet was Edward VII, so the main theme of the Parliament was to congratulate Edward VII, which was very boring for Arthur. After briefly chatting with Edward VII and expressing his heartfelt congratulations, Arthur found a quiet corner and sat alone. Perhaps he had already anticipated such a situation, or perhaps he simply did not bother to congratulate King Edward VII in person. William II did not appear at the banquet, but asked his son Crown Prince William to attend on his behalf. William II, on the other hand, had returned to Berlin after meeting Arthur that day. Fortunately, the banquet lasted not long. From 8 to 10 o'clock in the evening, which was only about 2 hours, after reluctantly enduring these 2 hours, as the banquet ended, Arthur quietly returned to his room. Although I was interested in asking Edward VII, I wanted to ask about the specific time for negotiations with the British government, but seeing the crowd of congratulators surrounding Edward VII at the banquet, Arthur had no choice but to give up. What Arthur didn't expect was that just on the afternoon of the next day, the Guard conveyed good news to Arthur. The British government decided to start discussions with the Australian diplomatic delegation on December 10, 2 days later. Negotiate support plan. This is good news for Arthur. After dealing with the British affairs earlier, he can also finalize the treaty with Germany earlier. Staying in the UK is not an option. Australia is now in dire straits and needs Arthur's personal attention. Time goes by very quickly, and December 10 is here in a blink of an eye. After 2 days of relatively thorough preparations, the Australian diplomatic delegation officially visited Whitehall in Westminster, London, which is where the Prime Minister's office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Defence, the Privy Council, the Ministry of Finance, etc. A street of important government offices. The negotiation took place in the conference hall of the Prime Minister's office. Officials from both parties participating in the negotiation included a prime minister, 6 ministers, and more than 40 officials from important departments. Because Edward VII handed over the decision-making power of negotiations to the British government, it was difficult for Arthur to come forward for a negotiation of this scale, and he could only leave it to the diplomatic mission to handle it. This is also a conspiracy of Edward VII. If the monarchs of both parties come forward together, then as Arthur's uncle, Edward VII will inevitably have to give in a little more, but now, Edward actually handed over the power of negotiation to the British government. Without Edward VII, Arthur's identity would not be easy to show up in such a diplomatic occasion. After all, you are a member of the royal family and a distinguished duke. To appear in such a fussy discussion would undermine the majesty of a nobleman and a member of the royal family, but if they do not come forward, Australia's diplomatic visiting team will not be directly proportional to the British officials in terms of position, status, or number, and will have some inherent disadvantages. However, Arthur has also made arrangements in advance. How the negotiation will turn out depends only on the efforts of all members of the diplomatic delegation. While Arthur was waiting anxiously, the discussion in the conference room of the Prime Minister's office also continued continuously. There were some arguments from time to time, but in the end they disappeared. At around 8 o'clock in the evening, there was a knock on the door of Arthur's room, and a familiar voice came in. "Your Highness, the deal is done." That it was 3 ministers from the diplomatic mission who knocked on the door. At this time, the faces of the 3 people were somewhat excited. It was obvious that the negotiation went smoothly and the agreement reached was in line with everyone's expectations. "Tell me, what was the result of the negotiation?" After sitting down in the office and letting the waiter serve a few cups of coffee, Arthur asked expressionlessly. "Overall, it went smoothly, Your Highness." The leader, Foreign Minister Andrew, said excitedly. Because various diplomatic means were required, this diplomatic mission was actually headed by Andrew as the leader, and Minister Pierre and Kent as the deputy leaders. "Have all our requirements been met? Has the aid plan been formally signed?" Arthur nodded calmly and continued to ask. "Basically, everything has been satisfied, Your Highness. Today we have discussed all the details of the treaty with the British government, and have agreed to formally sign the treaty tomorrow, and it will be officially implemented in the post-apocalypse for 10 years. Minister Andrews said with a smile. The 10-year period was decided by Queen Victoria, and neither Britain nor Australia had any intention of changing it. For the UK, it is not willing to bear such unconditional support for a few more years. After all, even if the support is small, it will still cost its own real money. For Australia, 10 years of support is completely acceptable. After all, people's hearts are not enough, and both Arthur and all officials are quite satisfied with this deadline. Approximately how much money can the aid treaty support us every year? How much can the corresponding industrial equipment and talents be supported? Has the issue of immigration been discussed? Arthur continued to ask. There are so many areas where Australia needs support, especially the immigration issue, which is the biggest difficulty that Australia needs to solve before it can rise. Whether it is developing industry or building infrastructure, a large amount of labor and population are needed. For Australia, which has a population of less than 4 million, there is only one way to achieve sufficient development, and that is to attract a large number of immigrants from Europe to increase Australia's population size as much as possible. First update, please support. Please vote for me, brothers. Your support is the biggest motivation for the author to code. Chapter 60 Immigration. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Your Highness, the British government has agreed to support us with funds or other industrial equipment worth £55 million. This fund will be paid in 10 years, with an annual share of £5.5 million. Minister Andrew explained with a smile. Prime Minister Robert agreed that we can choose how to pay for funds or industrial equipment and resources at will. Theoretically, in addition to British strategic technology and industrial equipment, any industrial equipment and resources can be equally exchanged with these support funds. Can the naval technology we need also be exchanged? Arthur asked with slight interest. British naval technology is one of the major factors that make the British Navy leading the world. Another major factor is the huge investment in the Navy and the two-power policy. I have to admit that even the German Empire, which has the second largest overall strength in the world, still lags behind the British Empire in terms of navy. Except for submarines, it can be said that it lags behind the British in terms of naval technology. Although Germany started to catch up with Britain in terms of navy after its rise, it will take a long time to slowly make up for the gap accumulated over a long period of time. The vast majority of naval technologies are available, Your Highness. However, Prime Minister Roberts specifically stated that the drawings of all battleships and large warships in service in the UK are not within the scope of support. Defence Minister Cantor said helplessly, even though the two sides have been discussing this for a long time, the British government did not agree to include drawings of battleships and large warships in service within the scope of support. Although having drawings does not mean that Australia can produce warships, drawings are also the most important thing for warships. With the drawings, the weaknesses of warships can be easily studied. Especially for potential enemies of the British Empire, drawings of warships in service are definitely a good thing. In fact, during the period of confrontation between the two major military groups, especially after Britain joined the Allied powers, the number of spies dispatched by European countries rose sharply. Among them, stealing the blueprints and data of warships was one of the important tasks of these spies. It doesn't matter, Minister Kent. When he heard that Britain was unwilling to share the drawings of warships, Arthur not only didn't look angry, but also laughed. Your Highness, if we want to build a navy, we can only buy warship drawings from Germany. However, compared to British warships, German warships are still slightly inferior in performance. Minister Kent frowned and said helplessly, the British were stuck with Australia in terms of naval drawings, which made Minister Kent a little dissatisfied. The Navy is willing to teach everything about technology, but it is unwilling to share the blueprints of warships. Isn't this equivalent to the chef buying all the cooking utensils for his apprentices, but not teaching them the recipes? Isn't this a fool's errand? That's fine, Minister Kent. Australia's industrial strength is also limited. In a short period of time, our navy will still be dominated by small and medium-sized warships. Our shipyards are capable of producing such warships. We just need to familiarize the workers with them. Once you are familiar with the shipbuilding equipment, you can start work by groping around. Arthur smiled and said comfortingly, our shipbuilding industry is still very weak. Even if the British give us the drawings, we will not be able to digest them in a short time. I think Germany the design of warships is very suitable. Compared with the United Kingdom, Germany's support for us is greater, and we can master its technology more quickly. Can we use British naval technology to build warships on the German warship drawings? Will the performance be even better? Arthur's words comforted Minister Kent very well, and the unhappiness about the British warship drawings quickly dissipated. In fact, compared to what he explained, the Real Arthur didn't care about those warship drawings. In fact, it was the dreadnought that would be born in a few years. The gap between the dreadnoughts and the main battleships before these dreadnoughts, to use an exaggerated saying on the internet, is that all the former dreadnoughts will be reduced to scrap metal after the birth of the dreadnoughts. Although the reality is not so exaggerated, the pre-dreadnought ship basically has no ability to resist in the face of the dreadnought. Whether it is based on surface data or actual combat capabilities, the dreadnought ship can crush the pre-dreadnought ship. The difference between dreadnoughts and pre-dreadnoughts does not lie in one aspect, but in their all-round crushing. For a warship, its combat performance is determined by sailing speed, armor thickness, firepower intensity, flexibility, soldier quality, etc. Apart from the external factor of soldier quality, whether it is sailing speed, armor thickness, vitality strength and flexibility, the dreadnoughts crushed the former dreadnoughts. To use a more appropriate word to compare, the combat effectiveness gap between a dreadnought and a pre-dreadnought is like that between a college student and an elementary school student. After the birth of the dreadnought, the current drawings of these British warships are basically useless. By then, the naval arms race among various countries will be dominated by dreadnoughts. What determines the strength of the navy is no longer these backward warships, but the number and combat effectiveness of the dreadnoughts. These active warships will not last long, which is the real reason why Arthur doesn't care about the drawings of these warships. What about the issue of immigration? Immigration should be said to be one of the most important issues in Australia, and it is urgent to introduce immigrants. Arthur said, Europe is currently in a relatively chaotic period, and coupled with the increase in the European population, major European countries are in the stage of immigration waves, according to rough statistics from later generations. From the early 19th century to the early 20th century, approximately 60 million people across Europe immigrated overseas, of which a full 35 million people immigrated to the United States. As the most powerful country in Europe, Britain has immigrated more than 8 million people in about 100 years, especially as the two major European military blocs confront each other and the arms race becomes more and more serious. The number of European immigrants has gradually increased since 1890. Every year, approximately 7 to 8 million Europeans choose to immigrate overseas permanently, although more than half of these immigrants chose to go to the United States. After all, the United States is one of the great powers comparable to European countries. Although it is not outstanding in the military, its industry and economy have surpassed many European powers, but Arthur is not greedy either. It is impossible to absorb huge numbers of immigrants like the United States in a short period of time. However, with Arthur's popularity in the UK and immigration support from Britain and Germany, coupled with Australia's publicity, it is still possible to account for 1/10 of the European immigrants. On the issue of immigration, the British government said it would try its best to help. They promised that they would never oppose immigration to Australia and the UK and would try their best to help Australia publicise various immigration policies. Foreign Minister Andrews said, although the British will not object to us attracting immigrants, but if we want them to help us directly, there is probably no hope. Second update, please support